Okay, right. So we've just started recording the meeting. What we're doing is we're recording this so that it can be shared for those that couldn't make it today and to put up on our website. Just to bear in mind, when it's being recorded, it should only have the person who's speaking and the sort of slide on view. Now, what we're tending to do is with questions and things is we're not mentioning people's names just in case they don't want to be mentioned when in the recording. And we're sort of doing that via the Zoom chat in terms of questions. If you do come in and say anything, just bear in mind that obviously you'll be on the recording and that will be, you know, available publicly. So just to bear that in mind. So yeah, if you hadn't seen already, if you could just name yourself, click in the corner of the video. We are muting everyone at the moment because we've got lots of people here, which is brilliant because there's a lot of interest in this topic. So please put your questions in the chat in the Zoom. So if you're not sure how to access that, you should have a little sort of bar where you can click on and press click on the chat and you can add your questions in there. We have already run a couple of officer events on this subject last week, and we've got one more tomorrow. We've had loads of questions, which is brilliant, and lots of feedback. We haven't been able to get around to all the questions, but we will be collating them all and putting new questions and answers on our frequently asked questions page. We've already got a Biodiversity Net Gain frequently asked questions page on our website, so do look at that. We're going to be using a few polls in Zoom. Those should pop up. They're relatively easy to use, so please do answer those. It's just really useful for us because then we can get a bit of a view from everybody who's in the room. As I said already, it's being recorded and it will be up on our website afterwards so you can share with colleagues. But that also means that if you we're tending to manage things through the chat and not mentioning people's names just so that we don't have to get permission to share that recording. But if you do say anything, then obviously you will be on that recording as well. We're running, as well as these sessions, so this is an overview of the consultation. We're also running some deep dive workshops in March for officers, so do liaise with your officers about those. We're just finalising the topics for those and we'll get those circulated later on, but we're using these events to decide which topics to focus on. Yeah, and this is being run by the Planning Advisory Service. We sit within the Local Government Association and we help local authorities with planning related aspects of policy, getting their local plans up to date and implementing new policy. My name is Becky Mobley and I'm leading on a project getting local authorities ready for Biodiversity Net Gain when it becomes mandatory in a couple of years' time. I've got a couple of colleagues in the room as well with me helping out. So I've got Rachel and Steve, and I think a couple of other PAS folk are in as well, but just listening in. So I won't mention them because they're more just there listening in at the moment. So I think if we're all good to go, we'll get started. I'm just going to give a little bit of an intro for you as councillors. This session is framed very much around the consultation, which came out around a month ago, and Defra will be talking through that consultation and you can ask questions about that. And we're essentially running the same presentation as we did for the officers. I'm aware that there's, as it was for the officers, there'll be a range of different experience in the room in terms of how much you know about Biodiversity Net Gain and how much you don't. So please do ask questions and we'll be led by your questions as to how much detail we go into. I'm just going to do a quick intro, which I didn't do for the officers event, just to sort of, I guess, factor in your leadership role and thinking about yourselves as councillors, and then I'll hand over to Defra. So just in terms of Biodiversity Net Gain and what does it mean for you? I mean, the obvious one is really if you're a part of a planning committee and involved in decision making on planning, Biodiversity Net Gain is going to be a key part of that decision making. And when it becomes mandatory for the majority of planning applications, that will obviously be a key part of consideration, is whether a project can be approved based on Biodiversity Net Gain. And also, you know, if you already have a policy in place, you're probably already thinking about the decisions you're making around biodiversity net gain. But beyond that, it links in a wider way to wider council strategy and objectives. So including things like the climate emergency. If your council's declared a climate emergency, biodiversity net gain has a direct link into addressing the climate and nature emergencies. And you know, can be a really good way of taking action to address the climate emergency in your local authority area. It also links into placemaking and infrastructure, so that includes green infrastructure and thinking about nature where people live, green spaces, making better places for people, and in many cases, you know, equal access to green space and that sort of thing. So it can really help in contributing to some of those wider issues. And also in terms of delivering natural capital and ecosystem services. So nature itself, well, it's a value in itself, and just because, you know, we love animals and plants, it also generates its own, it has its own wider benefits for all of us. So those can include things like improving air quality, flood resilience, obviously carbon offsetting, all those sorts of things. So again, that can link into those wider benefits for people in your area. As councillors, you've got a real role in terms of thinking about how this can be joined up across council services and embedding it in a wider sense across the council. So not just thinking of it as a planning issue. And that can be across a wide range of services, including, for example, estates. So if you've got a land holding yourselves as a council, you may want to start thinking about how you could put biodiversity net gain or use that land for biodiversity net gain or site delivery. Obviously, there's your key links into local communities, to farmers and landowners, and their interest in biodiversity net gain. In terms of where biodiversity net gain is going to be delivered off a development site, you know, those farmers and landowners are going to be really key in terms of that delivery and linking into local communities and what they want. So that's going to be really important in terms of your leadership and you know, bringing people together. And also in terms of the council, it's thinking about wider resources and skills and what you need to deliver this. And in many cases, the council won't already have all the resources and skills it needs to do this. So it's just thinking about that in a sort of broad sense, and that you know, where those people sit and how they can help embed this. So just thinking, the consultation is about biodiversity net gain coming in as a mandatory requirement in a couple of years' time. But we get a lot of questions about what you can do now around biodiversity net gain. And also because it's not coming in for a couple of years, it's well worth starting to prepare for that and starting to think about that in advance for various reasons. So the National Planning Policy Framework already sets the context in terms of requiring plans and projects, development projects to deliver measurable net gains for biodiversity, and local authorities to encourage that to happen. So in terms of what you can do in your council area, a number of local authorities have policies in their local plan for biodiversity net gain. The important thing to think about there is just making sure that you have a clear target and also a clear way of measuring net gain. If you're not at a stage where you're reviewing your local plan, but you have some kind of hook in policy terms, some places are also looking at supplementary planning documents around biodiversity net gain, or if they don't want to have something perhaps so fixed, perhaps guidance to developers or interim guidance that can be, interim guidance notes that can be produced. So there's some good examples of those around. The other way to do it is to just negotiate with developers on individual planning proposals and encourage them to do biodiversity net gain, and that's been fairly successful in some places. The risk there is that if you don't have something in policy terms, you can get pushback on that. And one of the things we are finding is because the National Planning Policy Framework isn't very strong in terms of what a net gain should be defined as. So when net gain comes in, it will be a 10% requirement, but that's not in the planning policy framework. If appeals are not generally going through on biodiversity net gain, if there's not where the local authority has refused it on the basis of the amount of biodiversity net gain that's being provided. So it's worth bearing in mind that you probably need some, you need to do it through negotiation early on with developers rather than at the sort of late stage of making the planning decision of the planning committee, because it's unlikely that biodiversity net gain can be implemented at that late stage. So that's worth thinking about, and then also the sort of policy context behind that in the short term. Obviously, when it becomes mandatory, it's going to be different because it'll be legally required. Yeah, and then it's also worth thinking now about how you can prepare for 2023. So thinking about the expertise you might want to source, what evidence you might want to gather in terms of what biodiversity is like in your local area, what evidence is already available, and also whether you might want to think about getting involved or setting up a local habitat banking scheme. So these are all things that you can start thinking about now. Okay, so I'm going to just leave it there in terms of the sort of intro, and I'm going to hand over to Max Heather at Defra to start talking about the consultation.
Great. Thanks, Becky, and yeah, welcome everyone to this session on the Biodiversity Net Gain consultation. If we go straight on to the next slide, we'll say a little bit about what's going to happen in the next hour or so. So the plan is to start off with some very quick introductions, and I'll give an overview of Biodiversity Net Gain and the consultation document itself. We'll then move on to a short poll about levels of local planning authority readiness, and we'll be seeking your views on what's needed to make, well, to improve that readiness and make sure that planning authorities are ready for Biodiversity Net Gain. So as you can see on the slide, the main part of today's event will be presentations and panel discussions on each part of the consultation document. And then we'll finish off with a final panel discussion to kind of pick up any other issues. And then we'll have a quick summary and some next steps from the Planning Advisory Service. So next slide again, please. So as you can see here, you've got quite a few people on the call talking this through. We've got colleagues from Defra, Natural England, and the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which collectively gives expertise on the net gain policy itself, the biodiversity metric, and the wider planning system that it will fit into. And so each panel discussion, as we go through each part of the consultation document, should have 4 or 5 leads from this list. So we should be able to cover the relevant topics, and you should hear a little bit from everyone at some point through the session. So next slide again, please. So this has been slightly preempted in the chat already, but I'll quickly cover what we mean by biodiversity net gain. And in a nutshell, that is delivering measurable improvements for biodiversity through development. So measuring the value of habitats for wildlife before development, measuring it again after development, and making sure that there's at least a 10% increase in that change. So some of you might have already spotted this diagram on the slide in the consultation. It's worth highlighting because I think it's a good way of displaying what net gain adds and crucially what net gain doesn't take away. We know there are already good protections in place for things like irreplaceable habitats, ancient woodlands, and strong planning protections for statutory protected sites and species. But it's those other habitats and the ones that aren't quite the top tier that often get lost to development projects. And so that's really what net gain is trying to add on to those existing protections and deliver gains in. So to be very clear, we're not taking away any existing protections for irreplaceable habitats, statutory protected sites, or other important features. Net gain is working alongside these other protections and processes to deliver gains or more gains for nature. So next slide again, please. So yeah, so I think we're on background and context. So as Becky's already shown, net gain isn't completely new. The National Planning Policy Framework has encouraged this for quite a while, since 2012 in some form. And the wording in planning policy on biodiversity net gain has sort of been marginally strengthened with each updated policy since then. In 2018, the 25-year environment plan set out the ambition to mainstream biodiversity net gain in the planning system and talked a little bit about a potential mandatory system. And then we consulted earlier in 2018 on biodiversity net gain becoming mandatory. And we set out some policy objectives at that point, which basically said we want to make positive outcomes for biodiversity. We want to improve the process for developers by setting out a really clear requirement for biodiversity net gain. And we want to create better places for local communities by having greener developments and habitat creation outside developments where that's necessary. So following that initial consultation and the response to those consultations, Government announced its intention to mandate biodiversity net gain through the Environment Bill. The bill then received royal assent, and so it became the Environment Act in November 2021, including the net gain provisions. And so they're now embedded within an Act of Parliament. That doesn't necessarily mean those provisions are in effect now. We'll come on to the transition period in a moment. But one point worth flagging is that biodiversity net gain isn't the only thing in the Environment Act, far from it, or the only thing in the 25-year Environment Plan. There's other policies in there that work alongside net gain, we think, to make the outcomes better. So a couple of ones particularly worth mentioning here are local nature recovery strategies and conservation covenants. Local nature recovery strategies are going to be locally produced spatial planning frameworks for nature with the help of national maps and priorities. And so the idea is that those will set out what nature is wanted locally and needed locally, and then through some multiplier adjustment in the metric, biodiversity net gain will effectively help deliver those habitats along with other policies. And then conservation covenants I mentioned, so they're a new voluntary standalone legal mechanism to secure long-term conservation management on land, and those will hold even if the land is sold and transferred ownership. We see that as a really good way of securing sites for biodiversity net gain, and will probably carry other uses for planning authorities as well in the sort of wider conservation space. So next slide, please. So the focus of today's session in particular is on that biodiversity net gain consultation now. So we're consulting after the Environment Act on the kind of practical and legal implementation details of mandatory biodiversity net gain. So we've got the sort of overarching framework in the Environment Act, but we're now looking at sort of detail that will underpin that and determine how it will work in practice. So the consultation covers both the Town and Country Planning Act development that will cover your typical 10 house to 50 house-ish developments, and to a lesser extent, so it will cover those Town and Country Planning Act developments, so generally residential sites, commercial premises, that sort of thing. But it also has a section very specifically on nationally significant infrastructure projects, which go through a separate planning regime. So the aims of the consultation are broadly to help improve understanding of biodiversity net gain, and set out a bit more of our thinking on how it will work, to give a pretty specific and robust meaning to biodiversity net gain, because we know in practice at the moment the term's often thrown around quite loosely. And it can cause some offence and concern when things are called biodiversity net gain that don't necessarily align with what we're saying biodiversity net gain will be. And ultimately to get the responses to the consultation so that we can use that feedback when we're shaping the secondary legislation, policy, delivery plans and guidance. So it's absolutely a two-way process, and it's why we're really keen on events like today's to hear what you think and how you think it should work. So on the consultation document itself, you have until the 5th of April to submit your responses to that. It's really helpful if you can submit them online through Citizen Space, and hopefully this event will help you pick up any kind of questions around the consultation or its context, and yeah, motivate you to respond as well. So on to the last slide from me, please. Just the main purpose of this slide is to highlight that it's not just the consultation going on until in the next few years. So we've got a 2-year transition period from the royal assent of the Environment Bill, so since those net gain requirements became law, into before the requirement takes effect. So the bill got royal assent and became the Environment Act last year. That 2-year transition period therefore means that we expect the biodiversity net gain requirement to commence in November 2023. So we've got the consultation now. We're expecting the responses from the current consultation will be used to help us develop the secondary legislation and a consultation response this year. We're expecting to lay that secondary legislation later this year into next year. Alongside the creation of secondary legislation, we'll also be developing art of guidance, which we'll be working on in the next few years as well. Some of you will already be familiar with the biodiversity metric that's used to measure those gains for nature. That was the current version of that was launched in July last year. We're looking to consult on a further version of that this year, so that'll be a formal consultation before we publish the sort of mandatory version of that biodiversity metric to be used from when biodiversity net gain becomes mandatory in 2023. We're also aiming for the biodiversity net gain site register, which you'll hear more about in a moment, and the statutory credit sales platform to go live in spring 2023. And then on, as I can see, it's come up already a few times in the chat, on local planning authority capacity and funding. We did say in our response in 2019 to the 2018 Net Gain consultation that we did recognise there was a burden attached to biodiversity net gain for planning authorities, and government did commit to meeting that new burdens funding requirement for planning authorities. In line with that, as at the same time as this consultation was published, a new funding pot of over £4 million was announced to help planning authorities prepare for mandatory biodiversity net gain before it comes into effect. So we're currently working through the details of funding distribution, when and how it will be delivered, and we'll issue further information on this as soon as we can. And we know it's something that is likely to come up in the discussion later. So local authorities, the idea is that you can use this funding to prepare for the introduction of mandatory biodiversity net gain. Some planning authorities we recognise will have more to do than others, and there's various ways that different authorities will want to go about this. You could increase your kind of ecological capacity amongst your planning officers, or upskill existing ecologists in the organisation. So that's a sort of flavour of the variety of things we're going to be doing up to November 2023, which is when we expect biodiversity net gain to take effect for new development after this 2-year transition period. And then even then there'll be work continuing beyond that, so there'll be ongoing monitoring and reporting of biodiversity net gain, which will show us whether the policy is working as intended in practice. And there will also be continuing updates to the biodiversity metric even after the consultation this year, and we expect those to happen on a regular basis long into the future. There is a slightly different timeline for nationally significant infrastructure projects, recognising that those tend to have much longer development timelines, and the fact that the requirement for those types of projects was added into the Environment Bill a little later, but it's not an enormously dissimilar timeline, and we'll again get to the detail of that later in this session. So other than the big green arrow showing that we're keen to engage throughout all of this on the left-hand side of the slide, I will hand back over to Rachel and Becky for the interactive session on readiness.
Brilliant, thanks everybody, and thank you for all your questions. You'll hopefully see that some of those have been answered by folk in the room as we've gone along. I'll probably come on to those anyway and sort of flag those. Keep the questions coming. We're going to have sort of 3 sessions of questions around the different parts of the consultation, and then a general sort of wash up. So we will come on to all of those, and we're capturing all of those. Before we start on the sort of the next bit of this, we're just going to run a couple of polls, just because it helps us get feedback from everyone in the room around what you're doing. So we've got one question about whether you have read the consultation, and then also just a question around how ready for biodiversity net gain your local authority is. So that's on a scale of 1 to 5. How prepared do you feel for biodiversity net gain becoming mandatory in late 2023? From 1, we've got a lot to do, to 5, we're ready to go tomorrow, or we're already implementing something similar. So it'd be great if you could answer that. That should have popped up in front of your screen. If you can't see it, it should come up, I think, if you click on the chat, but let us know in the chat if you're having trouble seeing that, and we can I don't know quite what we can do, but we can see what we can do. So yeah, if you do that, and then what we'd really like to hear is, if you think about that scale of 1 to 5, if you're not already at 5, which it would be brilliant if you are, but I suspect many of you won't be, what are the sort of top 3 things that you would like in order to get yourselves ready to get to 5? And I'll just get a bit of feedback around that as we go on. I'll just wait for people to sort of get themselves onto the poll and that sort of thing. And yeah, okay, so we've got money, lots of money, which and also recruiting and retaining ecologists. So I think that's obviously key feedback that we've been getting in the officer events as well, is around that funding and also the expertise. So it's resources, but also the right levels of expertise and knowledge. And Sue's just asked how we do the poll. The poll should have flashed up on your screen, Sue. So I'm not quite sure. I don't know if anyone else from PAS knows if it hasn't popped up where it might be. Oh, got it now, so that's good. Okay, so yeah, very much around that, getting the specialist knowledge, ecologists, Council-wide understanding has come up there.
Becky, just to let you know, there can be an issue if you're not supported by the right software, so maybe not everyone will be able to see the poll.
Okay, yeah, so apologies if you can't see it, but yeah, just put in the chat, basically you've got the question up there, so yeah, it'd be great to hear what you think. And I'll sort of run through a few key points that are coming up, but again, don't worry, you know, if I don't mention your point, it's not because we haven't clocked it, we're recording all these. So yeah, and that's good. More training, some case studies. So I'm going to go into, I mentioned at the beginning that we're doing, PAS is doing a project getting local authorities ready for Biodiversity Net Gain, and I'm going to run through what we're doing around that at the end, but part of that will be around sharing case studies, examples of how to do it. So yeah, just flipping through. Sort of specifics here around restoration, for example, of quarry issues, so sort of around the mineral side of things. But yeah, as usual, the key one is really around that knowledge and resources and expertise. Okay, so I think maybe I think probably most people are going to have answered. Oh no, I'll just leave the poll up for a few more minutes. So we've got some of you have read the consultation in full, which is brilliant, and some of you have read it in part. Those of you that haven't read it, hopefully this will help you understand what it's about, what's covered. And I guess the key thing is really just, you know, to encourage you as a local authority to respond and you know, answer the key questions for you and to share your experience and knowledge on this. Okay, there's a point here around farmer engagement, around realising biodiversity opportunities and how they fit in with agricultural development. Understanding how this works with nature recovery networks and how you ensure continuity where you've got different developers. More training for officers and councillors, and communication with stakeholders. Okay, I think maybe if we end the poll now and I can just share the results of that as well. So around half of you haven't read the consultation yet, so hopefully this will help you understand what's in it. So a mix, most people sort of around a 1 or a 2 in terms of readiness, a few people a bit more advanced in that, so that's really useful to hear. And yeah, as I said, we'll take into account all your feedback in this. It's really useful. So I'll just leave that a couple of minutes. Do please keep sharing those points in the chat. Rachel, was there anything that you thought it was worth flagging that I've missed in terms of points made there?
Sorry, I'm on mute. No, I think you've captured that well. It's all moving very quickly in the chat.
Yeah, okay, lovely. Thanks everybody, and do keep using those for questions. And yeah, as we said, apologies if you're not able to reply to the poll, but please do just put your thoughts in the chat. That's helpful. We can capture it that way as well. I'm sorry for those of you that it didn't work for. Okay, so we're going to leave that bit here. We'll come on to your questions in due course. I just wanted to flag a couple of sort of questions that have come up already, and we'll cover some of these sort of more general points at the end. What we're going to do is we're going to run, there's 3 parts to the consultation, it's in 3 sections, so we're going to have questions around each individual part and how they relate to it, but also there's quite a lot of questions that sort of come under a general, you know, how's this going to work type category. So just to highlight that there are a few points that have come up already in the chat. One of them was around asset stripping of sites before an application appears. So just to highlight that there is, in the Environment Act, that is actually covered, and once Biodiversity Net Gain comes in, there is a basically there's going to be a baseline for what the biodiversity value of a site is. And that's going to be the 30th of January 2020, which is when the Environment Bill first went into Parliament. So that issue around the potential removing biodiversity value before you account for it in terms of development is covered. And just to sort of highlight that there's a question around biodiversity net gain being provided on the development site or as close as possible, and yes, that is the preference, that it should be on the development site as a first off, and then as close as possible to that, as local as possible, and then only further as a last resort. And the metric which is used to measure biodiversity net gain incentivizes that. And just to highlight that, just a point around the sort of funding pot and how 4 million was announced on the 11th of January to help start preparing, but their results Defra are also looking at what further funding can be provided in addition to this. So okay, so just to highlight that those questions have already been answered in the chat, we'll move on, and I'll pass over to Emily Cole from Defra to talk through part one of the consultation, the consultation.
Thanks, Becky. Yes, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the contents of the condoc, or the consultation document, and then I'll go into each part in more detail, and then we'll follow that up with the panel discussions for each part. So as you can see, the condoc is split into 3 sections, and then each section will have a list of questions where we ask for your opinion on current policy ideas. So part 1 focuses on defining the scope of the biodiversity net gain requirement for Town and Country Planning Act development, and this covers 3 main points. So we've got exemptions, development within statutory designated sites for nature conservation, and then irreplaceable habitats. Part 2 focuses on the BNG requirement for other types of development. So we've got phased development and development subject to subsequent applications, small sites, and then nationally significant infrastructure projects, or NSIPs. And finally, part 3 focuses on how the BNG requirement will be implemented, and is therefore the largest section. So we've got 8 topics. So we've got the biodiversity gain plan, off-site biodiversity gains, the market for biodiversity units, habitat banking, the biodiversity gain site register, additionality, statutory biodiversity credits, and then finally reporting, evaluation and monitoring. So next slide, please. So part 1, like I said, this covers the scope of the biodiversity net gain requirement. If you're just looking for part 1 questions, these are questions 1 to 11. So we're aiming to strike a balance between making it suitable for a wide range of developments to address the cumulative small losses in habitat, but also robust enough to make sure that the losses are properly addressed. So next slide, please. So first up, we have exemptions, so questions 1 to 9. So we're only proposing to exempt the most constrained types of development, which do not result in substantive habitat losses. So therefore, we're proposing to exempt developments impacting habitats below a minimal threshold, householder applications, and then change of use applications. We're not proposing to exempt brownfield sites, which meet set criteria, temporary permissions, or developments for which permitted development rights are not applicable due to their location in conservation areas or national parks. Just a note to say that in the previous consultation, we had stated that we would exempt brownfield applications, but in this consultation, you'll see that we've changed our position on this and we're proposing not to exempt them. There are 2 proposals that we're considering to exempt. So these are the creation of biodiversity gain sites and then self-build and custom house building. It's also important to note that if there are any exemptions from mandatory biodiversity net gain, we're not preventing planning authorities requiring biodiversity net gains to be delivered. So this is at your discretion. You can decide to include it if you want to. So secondly, we've got development within statutory designated sites for nature conservation. So question 10 in the condoc. So BNG is required for statutory designated sites, and therefore it's not exempt from the requirement. So achieving BNG should not be seen or claimed as justification for otherwise unacceptable development on statutory designated sites. So therefore the BNG requirement will be separate and additional to existing legal policy requirements, and a distinction would need to be made. So I think there are benefits to this to ensure these sites can also achieve a net gain, and provides an opportunity to go beyond what is required for statutory designated sites, which may result in a no net loss. So for irreplaceable habitat, so question 11. As before, irreplaceable habitats are not included within the biodiversity metric calculation, but non-irreplaceable habitats will remain in the calculation. So for example, if you had a site with a mixture of both, you would just include the non-irreplaceable habitats and you would remove the irreplaceable habitats from being within the calculation. So planning policy already provides strong protections for these habitats. So with the NPPF stating that proposals resulting in the loss of irreplaceable habitats should be refused unless there are totally exceptional reasons. But if there are any losses, then bespoke compensation for these losses of irreplaceable habitat is still required, although exempt from the BNG requirement. So next slide, please. That was your quick run through of part one, and I'll pass you over to our speakers for the part one panel discussion.
Brilliant, thanks Emily. So we've had a few questions come in around exemptions particularly, so I will just cover those. There was a question around whether applications below 10 dwellings do not have to demonstrate biodiversity net gain. And just that was answered in the chat, but just to say that all development proposals are subject to biodiversity net gain requirements unless otherwise exempt. So it's not to do with the size, the number of dwellings, but small sites like those that have got 10 units or less do have, there's slightly different requirements in terms of the measurement through the metric. So I'm wondering if, just double checking my little list of who to ask questions, which I seem to have hidden. I just wonder, maybe Max, do you want to come in quickly to just explain a little bit more around the sort of small site side of things and the small site side of things, maybe in terms of
sure. So small sites, as Becky says, we're not at the moment proposing to make an exemption for small sites in general, but we recognise that the process might be relatively a bit more tough for them. So we're looking at other ways of making it a bit simpler. As Becky said, one of those is looking at how we measure net gains through the biodiversity metric. So we're looking at having a slightly more streamlined version of the metric for small sites. We're also looking at other ways we can make the process a little bit less onerous for small developments, and also are looking or considering a slightly longer transition period. So the consultation asks about whether it should be up to another year before the requirement is brought in for small sites, and the logic behind that is mainly that it would allow the planning authorities to get familiar with the system with the larger sites before the small sites are then subjected to the requirement. So we ask about a kind of range of extensions that we might make to the transition period for small sites, I think ranging from maybe 2 months to 12 months, but we'd welcome your views on those.
Okay, thanks Max. So there's quite a few comments here around leaving out permitted development and the feeling that that's not a good idea. So I think the key thing is just to, taking on board your comments, but please do submit responses to the consultation. I think from Defra's point of view, they're particularly interested in examples where that may be a particular issue, what type of permitted development perhaps, or examples of where you're aware of issues on permitted development, with permitted development causing biodiversity loss. Just got a question around, there are many property extensions and developments that remove trees and other garden features, i.e. ponds. The legislation really does need to address this loss. So I guess that would come into perhaps more the sort of householder side of things, rather than which is proposed as an exemption. Again, I'm not sure, is that Max? Are you okay to pick that up first of all? I don't know if anyone else wants to come in.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, do you recognise the issue and the loss of habitats through kind of householder applications and things below the threshold of requiring a planning application? I think ultimately what we're trying to do with biodiversity net gain is put in place quite a robust process. So the conflict we have in developing these proposals is wanting something that's robust enough to hold significant development to account and make sure that habitat's delivered well, but also something that can apply as broadly as possible. So we can include the smaller sites and development. I think when you go down to that sort of scale, the kind of thing we're talking about in the Environment Act isn't very proportionate. It would require quite a lot of process and expense ultimately for quite small developments. So what I'd say there is even if the very small household scale stuff isn't in scope of the biodiversity net gain requirement, there are other mechanisms through local planning policy that you could use to seek environmental improvement through that. So I think it's something we're not looking at dealing with through biodiversity net gain, but we think there are other mechanisms there. And I know trees were mentioned, there are tree protection orders, and it's something Defra's constantly looking at in that space to kind of protect urban trees more generally.
Great, thanks, Max. Okay, we've got a specific question about Class Q regulation. So this is for where buildings that have been used for agriculture and where they have a, I think they don't have to get planning permission for certain requirements, and a concern about how those are applied. I don't know if they're not on this panel, but I don't know whether perhaps Matt or Laura from DLUHC, I don't know if you've got a view on those. I think that's quite a sort of niche aspect. I don't know whether that's been covered.
Hi, Becky. Yeah, only me this evening. I'm afraid this will have to be one that I take away, if that's all right. Yeah. And it could be something we add to the PAS FAQs, perhaps.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks. Yeah, so we'll take that one away and have a look at that one. Okay. Just a question about permitted development rights on military airfields. And whether a local authority might have a place in ensuring that a biodiversity net gain assessment is done, and making sure that compensation happens locally, so it's not on an airfield site in another part of the country. I suppose this is around the sort of where you might have some flexibility in local policy around what the exemptions are and that sort of side of things. Can I come to you again, Max?
Yeah, so it's a good question. If it is permitted development, ultimately it's not going to be captured by the statutory condition for biodiversity net gain. That said, we realise that some permitted development does take place in kind of MOD estate, and so we're talking to MOD quite frequently about what they're doing across their wider estate, and I know they've got good biodiversity ambitions across the estate in general. Whether that translates into direct compensation within the local area or not in every case, I don't know. I'd be really interested in examples so we can bring it up in future discussions with MOD. But yeah, just because it's not something that, if it is a permitted development, it wouldn't be captured by biodiversity net gain.
Okay, thanks,
just to briefly build on what Max said as well, I know a number of developers, even though they're going through permitted development, are actually still delivering biodiversity net gain as well, and using the same metrics. A number of water companies, for example, are doing that even where the development's permitted. Yeah. And they would still then have the same incentive to deliver the gains locally to the development site as well. So I would still encourage, in the case of the MOD, kind of local engagement around that particular development as well, because they may find quite a receptive conversation anyway. And if they're using the metric, that would be incentivizing you to deliver your gains kind of quite local to the airfield site in that instance.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, brilliant. And thanks for the example. What I can do is I can put you guys maybe in touch with Defra. Thanks for the example in the chat there. I'll put you guys in touch separately on that. So that's really helpful. Okay, great. Just double checking if we've got any more specifically around these bits. There's a question around sort of, I think I might come on to that actually in the next session, part 2. Just a question about irreplaceable habitats. Are rivers irreplaceable habitats? I don't know if we've got Nick, Mel and Jen from Natural England. Nick, do you want to come in?
Yeah, happy to. So at the moment, the MPPF lists a set of habitats which are suggested as being irreplaceable, and rivers aren't part of that. Natural England is undertaking a review with others into providing a clearer definition of what would constitute a habitat being irreplaceable, and looking to come up with an updated list of that. So we'd very much welcome kind of thoughts of kind of input into that process as well. There's likely to be some level of kind of wider engagement around that as well. So, the list of what is an irreplaceable habitat is coming up. But just on rivers, though, you will find rivers appear in lots of different kind of a range of different categories in terms of how important they are. And some of them do get are very significant and do get very high levels of kind of valuation within the biodiversity metric. Others much less so if they're culverts, for example. Yeah, so there is scope to kind of influence what's constituting replaceability, and also rivers do get significant levels of valuation through the biodiversity metric.
Brilliant, thanks, Nick. Okay, I think that's most of those questions coming in on specifically on that part. I don't know anyone. Rachel, is that can you see any others that I haven't picked up?
I think you've covered them well, Becky.
Okay, brilliant. Right. Okay, so I'll hand back over to Emily and we'll move on to part 2 of the consultation. If I can find my mouse, I think it's gone onto a different screen. Where is it? There we go. Lovely. Okay, right. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you. So part 2 sets out how we apply the biodiversity gain objective to different types of development. So these are questions 12 to 27 in the conduct. So next slide, please. So I'm going to start with phase development and development subject to subsequent applications. So questions 12 to 13. So flexibility is required to accommodate changes over time. So particularly where development is delivered over a long period or where detailed proposals are submitted for approval through reserved matters. Therefore, we understand that there needs to be a method for securing principles around how BNG is delivered when permission is granted, with further approval processes for subsequent applications. There'll be additional biodiversity gain information to be submitted with the application, which we propose will consist of a strategy for achieving BNG across the whole site and how this will be delivered on a phase-by-phase basis. So this information would include key principles to be followed, how the biodiversity net gain delivery will be tracked on a phase-by-phase basis, the approach taken if subsequent phases do not proceed or fail to deliver biodiversity net gain, that the pre-development biodiversity value would be agreed and used as the basis for agreeing the detailed proposals through subsequent applications pursuant to the approved development, and finally, a mechanism to link the framework plan to subsequent applications. For any variations to a planning permission, the mandatory net gain condition imposed on the original permission will continue to apply. So for any proposals that affect the post-development biodiversity value, the local planning authority will need to approve a new biodiversity gain plan for the proposal, but the baseline use should be the same as the baseline previously applied. So small sites, questions 14 to 15. So small sites were kept within the scope of mandatory net gain following the 2018 consultation, but were considered against 4 themes of variation, which we are requesting feedback on in this consultation. So firstly, a potentially longer transitionary period. So one of the key questions we're asking for small sites is, would an extension to the 2-year transition period benefit planning authorities? Secondly, lower percentage targets. So we're not recommending any change to the 10% net gain requirement for small sites, as all small sites make up a proportionate contribution to BNG. And we viewed that adding a smaller percentage aim would introduce more complexity. Thirdly, simplification of the process. So this involves a simplified metric and extending the transition period as mentioned. So additionally, we're also aware of efforts being undertaken to provide services to automate some elements of the tool, and we expect further innovation to minimize burdens for small sites whilst also improving ecological outcomes. And finally, the simplified metric as mentioned. There's already a simplified biodiversity metrics for small sites specifically that can be used. So some of you may have already seen that. And then finally, nationally significant infrastructure projects. So questions 16 to 27. So this was a more recent addition to the Environment Act before achieving royal assent. Because it's a recent addition, the policy proposals aren't as detailed as those in the Town and Country Planning Development section. So consultation on details and wording for the NSIP requirement will be happening. So there'll be further engagement on this, as we know there's more work to be done. So we're asking, particularly in this consultation, what needs to be different in the approach for NSIPs. So any feedback that we get from your answers will help us work out how the approach for NSIPs will be different. So for example, in this, we're asking whether there should be any targeted exemptions just for NSIPs, and also asking for people's opinions on the transition period for NSIPs and how maybe this could be different as well. So that's the summary of part 2, and then I'll just pass you over for the part 2 panel discussion.
Lovely, thanks, Emily. Okay, brilliant. So I'm just picking up just a couple of questions that sort of relate more to the previous section again, just to flag they've been answered in the chat. So there was just a question about HS2 and whether that was subject to the biodiversity net gain requirement. And just to so Nick's answered that and clarified that phase 2B of HS2 has publicly committed to delivering biodiversity net gain, but it's governed by separate legislation. So it has its own bill, so it's not actually covered by the sort of mandatory requirement. And just there was a question about local wildlife sites as well and how they'll be treated. Local wildlife sites do have policy protections through the National Planning Policy Framework, so that doesn't change under in relation to biodiversity net gain. So I guess something really important that Max highlighted at the start is all of this comes on top of existing protections and existing policy guidance. Yes, I mean, development does sometimes happen on these sites, which is a real pity, but I think that from my point of view, I think it's good to have something there that actually will deliver good compensation for those, because I know in the past I've dealt with planning applications that didn't end up with anything being provided in terms of compensation. So hopefully that'll help where as a last resort they do get developed on. Okay, so I was just going to flag that those points had come up, and just on phase development, just double checking, we had a question from the previous one. We have developers who try to break developments into smaller chunks to avoid section 106 contributions. How would you suggest this is countered? Matt, I don't know if you've got any thoughts around that and how that might be avoided.
If this is with respect to the net gain calculation, I suspect this is something that Defra colleagues might be able to deal with in sort of splitting up sites.
I guess that would end up.
I think, sorry, if I can just, I think I might be able to come in on this. So I think it's referring to the kind of salami slicing, right, where you cut up your project so that it fits under the thresholds of various contributions. And so I think there is some data to suggest that does happen for section 106 payments, where there is that threshold for contributions, and a few other things. I think net gain, we're generally not expecting that to be, I mean, it will obviously bring a cost, and particularly when the baseline biodiversity is high, but we don't expect it to put the same sort of strong financial incentive on developments to kind of carve themselves up to avoid the net gain requirement. And I'd also say, I mean, I think because we have got a broad scope of the requirements, so small sites are in scope, there isn't that same incentive to carve it into smaller chunks, because you'd have to carve it into such small chunks that it just wouldn't be worth it in terms of the extra application process for the development. So I don't think it's such a big issue for net gain as it is for some other development contributions. I don't know, Matt, if you'd want to add anything to that.
There's nothing more from me.
Yeah, and I think I know that at a previous event we had a question about the small sites metric and it being less onerous, and does that create an incentive to do that? But I think the feedback was that actually the way it's measured, you have to deliver the same amount of biodiversity net gain as you would for if everything came together. And as Max said, it probably ends up being harder to do a load of calculations and a load of applications rather than do it separately. So yeah, okay, just double checking. We've covered the HS2 side. I've just got a question that was submitted actually prior to the event around NSIPs. The question is, why does mandatory BNG apply to NSIPs but not marine development? I don't know whether I maybe bring Nick, did you want to come in, because you can talk perhaps about the marine side of things?
Yeah, so some marine developments obviously are NSIPs, and some of them cover both the terrestrial, the kind of subtidal elements in terms of if they're out to sea, but also got bits of cabling coming on land as well. So potentially they're covering different regimes, different planning regimes. So There is a forthcoming consultation, which is separate to this current one, looking at what a approach to marine net gain might look like. So there is something coming for which would apply to the kind of marine kind of subtitle elements of such schemes. But the kind of landward side of those developments, everything from mean low water coming ashore, is covered by the kind of mandatory net gain approach as well, because that does apply to all NSIPs, including those in the kind of the intertidal area. So at the moment, subtitle there isn't a policy around net gain for marine, but that's coming, and there's a future consultation coming on that. And then for NSIPs on land or down to mean low water mark, at the moment they would be covered by the kind of proposals under the mandatory net gain, albeit to a slightly longer time frame than Town and Country Planning Act developments.
Okay, thanks, Nick. There's another question about NSIPs, which is, could planning inspectorate decisions of NSIPs be delayed because the biodiversity net gain policies regarding NSIPs are unconfirmed? I don't know, maybe Becky or Max. Becky, do you want to come in?
So we will be publishing a draft policy statement for NSIP, a BNG in NSIPs. So that will be published, and there'll be a 2-year transition period. So we're consulting, and in the consultation, there are questions about whether you agree with the acceptance threshold as to when BNG should be applied to a NSIP. So you'll see through the consultation, we do ask for input on various points, and also that we'll be publishing, as I said, a draft statement for consultation, and there'll be a 2-year transition period for that.
Great, thanks, Becky.
And so I just add to that, that yeah, as Becky says, the policies coming in, I think in the meantime, the national policy statements continue to apply as they are. A number of those already contain quite strong references to biodiversity net gain. So you'll see like the recent draft policy statement for water resource infrastructure had some quite strong wording on biodiversity net gain. So we're generally expecting that kind of trajectory to incrementally stronger wording in national policy statements, and then this will come in with the transition period. So there should be quite clear stages of different levels of net gain applying.
Lovely, thank you. I don't know if this is sort of broader than the consultation, but it might be helpful. Somebody's just asked who gets to define an NSIP. So I mean, I know that's defined through the legislation. I don't know, Matt, if you've got any sort of quick summary of what's classed as an NSIP, and what, I know there's a huge number of sort of types of development that are classed as NSIPs.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid I don't. It's dealt with another division within the directorate. And I don't think Chris is present on this call, so I wouldn't have a definition for that, I'm afraid.
No, I mean, yeah. I mean, basically I mean, I guess, you know, it tends to be certain types of development. So things like power stations, particularly road schemes, they used to be dealt up with under a range of different legislation. So often they will be requiring an environmental impact assessment anyway. Very rarely do they not. That they have a number of they tend to be those sort of bigger schemes with more significant impacts generally. Okay, we've had some questions about local plans and what you can do in terms of what flexibility you might have in your local plan for biodiversity net gain. We'll come on to those in the next section. So just to say we haven't forgotten those, we've got those. And also just a couple of questions about viability. So again, we'll come on to those. I think, what have we got? We've got a question around a site where there's a meadow that's over 150 years old. It has been designated for houses in the future. I'm guessing that means it may have been allocated in the local plan. And how protected will this be when development takes place? I guess the point to note is if it already has been through the planning process and the planning application, in terms of phase development, that biodiversity net gain won't apply after it's got the initial outline. Matt, did you want to come in and just explain that sort of process in terms of outline, getting, you know, the initial permission, and then you can have the reserve matters, but those, if that comes in prior to the regulations, that won't be
yeah, of course. Yeah, so with the net gain requirement coming into force in November 2023, certainly in the case of outline planning applications where they are determined before that implementation date, they will not be subject to the net gain requirement, and then subsequent applications for reserve matters approval will not be subject to the requirement. Where an application comes forward which is determined before that date, then that will be eligible for the net gain, and then reserve matters coming forward will also have to obviously contribute towards that net gain.
Great, thanks, Matt. Okay, I think that's it in terms of questions on that section. So I think if we move on now, and obviously any questions that we'll try and come to as many questions that sort of more overarching at the end. So if I pass back to Emily, who's going to cover part 3 now.
Thanks. Yep. So finally, part 3. So how the BNG requirement will work. Just to clarify, because I've seen a few questions in the chat, that the minimum requirement is 10%, but local authorities can set their own target above this in their local plans, and this is stated in the Environment Act, so you can go above 10%. So for any development subject to that requirement, it will be necessary to assess and understand the baseline habitats and design options for the site, secure and register any off-site habitat enhancement if sufficient BNG cannot be secured on-site, purchase statutory biodiversity credits if off-site enhancement cannot be secured, submit the completed biodiversity game plan to the planning authorities, and wait for the plan to be approved before development can commence. So I'll cover each of these points in more detail. So next slide, please. So first up, we've got the biodiversity game plan, so questions 28 to 29. So our aim is to introduce a consistent format for developers to demonstrate whether biodiversity net gain has been met, and for local planning authorities to be able to check whether proposals have met that objective. So instead of having to check a variety of different templates, the hope is that by introducing a consistent format, it'll be easier for the requirement has been met and will hopefully save time. So that's how I'd really value any of your feedback on the template, and this is provided in Annex B of the condoc, and obviously will be updated based on people's responses in the consultation. So as part of the template, the biodiversity game plan must provide information about how the development has taken steps to avoid and minimize impacts, so essentially following the mitigation hierarchy which biodiversity net gain encourages. The pre and post development biodiversity value, so essentially assessing the change as a result of the development, any off-site gains, and any statutory credits purchased. So we understand that being able to get an idea early on of what is being proposed for BNG is important for local planning authorities. So we're therefore proposing through secondary legislation that certain core information is required at the planning application stage, and the full and finalised plan is not required until before commencement. So this is based on the recognition that certain aspects, such as landscaping, are not fully developed at the planning stages. We're also aiming to produce a more concise version for small sites and a different template for outline development applications. So next up, we've got off-site biodiversity gains, so questions 30 to 31. So in line with the mitigation hierarchy, off-site gains should only be used when impacts could not be avoided or minimised, and on-site gains cannot be achieved. So developers will be able to deliver off-site biodiversity gains on other land holdings or purchase biodiversity units on the market. Off-site gains will be encouraged locally by policy and guidance, and then areas outside the local area will be considered if local opportunities are insufficient for the developer. We'll also be publishing further guidance for decision-making for granting permission or approving plans based on the consideration of on-site and local off-site options before being able to look further afield. We want to minimise the delays between development impacts and the delivery of compensatory habitat. So we propose that compensatory habitat is delivered no more than 12 months after discharge of mandatory pre-commencement condition. And although not a policy requirement, To prevent delays in habitat enhancements being delivered, resulting in fewer units being generated and more enhancement required, we would encourage looking at habitat banking. So this would allow enhancement to be delivered before the development takes place. A big point for offsite biodiversity gains is that they must be maintained for at least 30 years after the completion of the initial works to create or enhance the habitat. Next up, we've got the market for biodiversity units, so questions 32 to 34. So any landowners will be able to create or enhance habitats for the purpose of selling biodiversity units, provided that they meet requirements of the policy and demonstrate no significant adverse impacts on protected and priority habitats. Planning authorities will also be able to sell biodiversity units from their own land or act as a broker for third-party units. So if as a planning authority, you choose to participate in the market, you will be expected to manage any associated conflicts of interest and will need to comply with the same rules and requirements that apply to other biodiversity unit suppliers. Other things to be aware of in relation to the market as a planning authority: biodiversity net gain will not enable planning authorities to direct developers to purchase biodiversity units from them in preference to other market suppliers that are able to deliver equivalent or better outcomes. And also planning authorities will not be able to charge developers a general tariff for delivery of offsite gains, which is not associated with specific gain sites that are registered and allocated to the development in question. If a developer exceeds the statutory biodiversity net gain requirement on site, we are minded to allow them to use or sell excess biodiversity units as offsite gains for another development. This area of land would need to be clearly identified in the biodiversity gain plan. And in order to facilitate the operation of the biodiversity unit market, our priorities include setting clear regulations and providing guidance, arranging oversight functions to ensure consistent implementation, creating supporting systems if needed, avoiding conflicts of interest in relation to the role of the UK government and other public sector bodies, and finally, establishing an approach to statutory biodiversity credit pricing, sales and investment which supports and does not conflict with the market. And finally, we do not currently propose to establish a centralised trading platform for biodiversity units or for the UK government to take on other roles which could be performed by the private sector. So next up, habitat banking, which I previously mentioned. So questions 35 to 37. So this can help to smooth out the supply and demand by completing necessary works to establish the habitat in advance and banking the resulting units, so they are available for sale when needed by developers. So we recognise the benefits of habitat banking and are considering how the UK government can best support this and how we can provide clarity on the minimum requirements to develop investment plans. A habitat bank would need to be able to record and provide suitable monitoring information to demonstrate that the initial works to create or enhance the habitat have been completed by a given date. And what we essentially want to know from this consultation is, are the proposals that we've set out here sufficient to enable and encourage habitat banking? So next up, we've got the biodiversity gain register, so questions 38 to 43. So this would be a publicly available register of off-site gains with clear criteria in place to ensure sites are providing legitimate gains for biodiversity. So we would work with stakeholders to design the register to allow local communities to access information on habitat sites being delivered. This would help avoid any double counting of biodiversity units as well. So for off-site gains to be included in a development's gain plan, they must be registered on the biodiversity gain site register and those gains allocated to the specific development in question. To be included on the register, there'll be an online application and a register operator will assess whether the application meets that criteria. So a key point is that any development which does not require off-site units as part of the gain plan will not require an application to the register. It's for off-site gains. So the register operator will determine an application against the set of criteria within a maximum of 28 days, based on our assumption at this stage. Applicants can also appeal a decision if they haven't been allowed onto the register. And the UK government will set a fee for registration, will also impose financial penalties for the provision of false or misleading information. So in the consultation, we'd really welcome any views on whether this strikes the balance between speed and allowing the register operator sufficient time to review applications. So additionality, questions 44 to 47. So additionality is an important principle in compensation. It's defined as a real increase in social value that would not have occurred in the absence of the intervention being appraised. So mandatory biodiversity net gain will be addressed alongside other development and environmental policies, so green infrastructure policies. But we are aware of the current uncertainty about the extent to which enhancements undertaken in response to wider policies, legislation and markets can be counted towards a development's biodiversity net gain calculation. So provided that the enhancements in question meet all the other requirements for biodiversity net gain, we're proposing that the following can also be used towards biodiversity net gain. So firstly, any measure within the development site boundary. So this can be counted towards biodiversity net gain, provided that the biodiversity metric recognises the uplift in biodiversity value. So this includes on-site measures delivered to comply with a statutory obligation or policy. Secondly, mitigation and compensation measures for protected species. So these can be counted, but should not make up all of a development's biodiversity net gain. So the conduct states at least 10% of the gain should be delivered through separate activities, which are not required to mitigate or compensate for protected species impacts. So to clarify, we're saying 10%, not 1%. So it's 10% of your overall habitat offering should be from BNG. So this is 10% of the gross gain rather than 10% of the net gain, which would be 1% gross gain. Thirdly, adequate mitigation and compensation measures for any on-site and indirect impacts on statutory protected sites can also be included in the biodiversity metric calculation, but only when these measures have been agreed with the decision maker. So any losses to protected habitats caused by the development should also be included. Fourthly, actions and measures within the river basin management plans can be used to achieve biodiversity net gain. And finally, organisations subject to the NERC Act may generate and sell biodiversity units. We're also considering whether to allow enhancement of the non-designated features of statutory protected sites. However, we are aware that such an approach might introduce additional complexity. We're also aware that for planning authorities, biodiversity net gain can provide an important source of funding to establish and enhance local wildlife sites and local nature reserves, and propose that we do not interfere with this option and its potential long-term benefits. We're also proposing combining payments for biodiversity units with other payments for different environmental services from the same parcel of land. This will depend on the different rules for each scheme, and we would plan to review this and produce guidance for this if we do. So next up, we've got statutory biodiversity credits. So questions 48 to 51. So the purpose of statutory biodiversity credits, which are the credits sold from the UK government to the developer, is to avoid unreasonable delays in the planning system if developers are unable to deliver net gain on-site, off-site, or by purchasing biodiversity credits on the market. So the UK government expects but cannot guarantee that the market will meet the demand for biodiversity units from day one. Therefore, the need for statutory biodiversity credits will be available to developers as a last resort. But developers must be able to demonstrate as part of the net gain plan that they are unable to achieve net gain on-site, off-site, or through purchase of biodiversity credits on the market. Further guidance would be published to support the decision maker by developers and planning authorities. The UK government will also undertake a credit price review to confirm how the price for statutory biodiversity credits will be set, and an initial credit price will be published in advance of biodiversity net gain becoming mandatory. The preference is for developers to purchase credits prior to final approval of the biodiversity gain plan and discharge of the pre-commencement condition. Revenue from credit sales will be invested in strategic habitat creation and enhancement that delivers long-term environmental benefits. And finally, we've got reporting, evaluation, and monitoring. So questions 52 to 55. So in the conduct, we've split this into project level and policy level reporting, evaluation, and monitoring. So at the project level, it will be developers reporting on whether habitats are meeting the target condition and reporting this to local planning authorities. It will be the landowner or developer's responsibility to ensure the monitoring and reporting obligations are fulfilled. To assist with this, Natural England are working on a standardised process and template for habitat management and monitoring. And any failure to deliver will result in enforcement by the planning authority. At the policy level, it will be local planning authorities reporting to Defra on whether biodiversity net gain as a policy has been a success. So by knowing early on how it's working, we can tweak things. And we've also intentionally created opportunities to refine the policy and legislation in response to evaluation findings and how it's working in the real world. So there'll be several biodiversity net gain mechanisms to support at the policy level. So we've got the biodiversity gain site register, as previously mentioned. So this would provide a publicly accessible record of proposed off-site enhancement. We've got biodiversity reports published every 5 years by planning authorities, clearer and standardized reporting of habitat losses and gains in gain plans, enhancement monitoring and habitat survey data, and finally, the annual report on statutory biodiversity credits investment. So that is part 3, and I will now pass on for the part 3 panel discussion for any of your questions.
Great, thanks Emily. And we've had lots of questions coming in, so that's great. So I'm just looking at where to start. I think maybe if we start with a question around habitat banking. So this is one that came in before, but I know that we've had one that was sort of similar earlier on as well. So we've got one here about how can we ring fence for local projects, and can we bank for local use? Sorry, for future use is what I was trying to say. So I think we've got, in terms of banking, we've got Max and Tom covering that today. So I don't know if either of you wants to come in on that side of things.
Yeah, I can start, and Tom, feel free to add anything on the banking point. Absolutely, yeah, you can create habitat for future allocation to individual developments. That's good. It's good to have the habitat in early. And the first part of the question, sorry, Becky, that was another part, wasn't there?
It was how can we ring fence for local projects? So I guess that's ensuring that it's delivered locally. Yeah,
so I think habitat banking is a great way to do that, to actually make sure that you have got units available that you've created locally. It's a good way to make sure that it gets invested locally. One thing I should be clear on the ring fencing, as Emily said, we don't generally want to see, and the Act won't actually allow for it, we don't want to see the kind of just general pooling of funds for future investment towards net gain. We think that's likely to lead to lots of funds sitting unspent in accounts. So we really want specific projects to be targeted for funding, which would then have their units sold to developers. So habitat banking works really well for that, because as a local planning authority, you could do your habitat creation, come up with the clear plan for it, and then sell those to developments as a way to meet their net gain. Tom, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, nothing to add, thanks.
Brilliant, okay, thanks.
Becky, could I just add a very quick point just on top of what Max has just said as well? So in addition to what Max has said, I think this is a real opportunity as well to think, actually, how could net gain help to deliver your local nature recovery strategy aspirations? So how could you create a bank in a place that locally you think, actually, that's the ideal location, that's really where we want to see habitat created or enhanced to build connectivity, help connect between local wildlife sites or whatever as well. So I would encourage people to also think quite strategically about where these habitat banks get created as well. And the more strategic they are, there is a reward mechanism in place through the metric, which means it will incentivize developers to basically contract with that habitat bank as well. So.
Great, thanks, Nick. So a couple more around the habitat banking side of things. One is around what types of land can be used as a biodiversity bank. So the person asking the question is their areas within a biosphere and has many SSSI areas. So again, Max or Tom, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, so it's something we are seeking views on in the consultation very explicitly. So generally any land, but when we talk about SSSIs, less so for biosphere, I think, because that's more of a broader designation, but for SSSIs in particular, we know there are already obligations on in place to bring those into favourable condition. So there's a bit of a question then of, actually, is what you're proposing as biodiversity net gain really additional, or would it have happened anyway as part of protecting that SSSI? So I think in the consultation we ask about a proposal to allow enhancements within SSSIs, but only to the bits which aren't specifically part of the designation. So you could enhance the wider site fabric or the land around the SSSI, but not the sort of key biodiversity features that the SSSI is designated for. we are seeking views on that. We know that that could end up being quite complicated in practice, so we're interested in alternatives. It might be simpler just to say, no, you can't do your net gain enhancement within SSIs, but you can within wider sort of protected landscapes, to just make sure that additionality gets delivered. But yeah, interesting views.
Okay, great, thanks, Max. Then a further question, habitat bank units the question is, would they then have to be adjusted for a developer to reflect distance from the site? So I guess that's taking into account the metric that it needs to be linked into the development site. Yeah, I don't know.
Yes, is the short answer to that. Yeah, the metric does take account of distance. So it works at a sort of planning authority or national character area scale. So you shouldn't end up having to fiddle around with the numbers if it's just a few miles down the road in the same planning authority area. But yeah, if you are looking at transferring credits across units across longer distances, then that will have to be reflected in the metric. Nick, did you want to add anything there?
No, just to also add, it also rewards though the delivery into areas that are of strategic importance locally as well. So again, yeah, I was saying earlier, if the habitat bank is located somewhere that is reflective of your local priorities in a local nature recovery strategy or equivalent, then it also has a positive kind of the metric recognises that as well, and it incentivises the developer to deliver their net gains in that location. They can get more units than they would elsewhere.
And can I just come in there as well? So somebody mentioned a question earlier about water quality, and I know several local authority areas will have issues around nutrient pollution and nutrient neutrality schemes. That could be one of your strategic areas, and biodiversity net gain could be fed into that to see how it can alleviate that problem as well. So there are lots of synergies that well planned can really build on biodiversity net gain.
Great, thanks guys. Okay. So I just think I've got one more on habitat banking. So this is more, I guess, the sort of process of it, but can identifications of suitable units for BNG banking form part of a landowner's business plan? So yeah, Max or Nick, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think so. That sounds like a very sensible thing to include in a landowner's business plan. Nick, is there anything else we should mention there?
Yeah, and it would just be starting to think as well about are they happy to them becoming familiar with the kind of legal requirements that they would be under as well, in terms of they would need to ultimately to get the site registered and to manage and maintain the habitats and kind of report on it. But yeah, it's potentially and is proving to be a growing kind of attractive commercial proposition to some landowners as well. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point about it. It is worth just making sure that the landowner is aware of the 30-year plus commitment, really, yeah, because there's a minimum 30-year management requirement for these habitats for net gain, and we'd like them to be in place longer than that, if at all possible. So it's worth flagging the kind of long-term commitment that goes with that.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Okay, that's great. And I just wanted to say, it's brilliant, all the questions. We're obviously getting a huge range from some detailed and some more general ones. So I guess if you are finding some of the questions a bit very detailed and perhaps beyond your area of expertise, please don't be put off. We will be sharing the recording. This is part of a sort of process in terms of learning about biodiversity net gain, and you'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss it further with your officers. We're going to be doing more through the PAS project to hopefully provide you resources as well. So yeah, so please don't sort of be put off if some of the questions are more detailed than your expertise now. It's very much hopefully start of a conversation rather than the end of it, but hopefully this will help you at least in terms of thinking what the issues are in your local authority area that you particularly want to feed back on the consultation and the questions you might want to focus on. Okay, so just sort of carrying on with the part 3 side of things, just a bit more clarity around the biodiversity credit money would be useful. Where does the money go from? Are they just money? If there's nothing on the market, then nothing happens. How does that work? And also, just picking up if there's any others. But yeah, some general questions there around what the system means would be helpful. I think again that's Max and Tom, if that's all right. I don't know which one of you wants to come in.
I'll quickly come in on credits and where that money goes, or we hope it will go. So I'll start off by just reiterating that distinction between kind of biodiversity units, which is where we see developers paying landowners locally, ideally, for some habitat enhancement through the market, and then statutory credits are what developers will need to buy if those market units aren't available. So it's the mechanism we've got whereby government can effectively sell biodiversity enhancements to developers in order to let them meet their biodiversity net gain requirement. That money then obviously comes to government in some form, and the consultation talks a little bit around this. We then want to reinvest that money straight into habitat creation and enhancement nationally. We've got intentions to try and mirror that to the localities where the money's come from. Obviously, that will be easier in some cases than in others if there's a larger amount of money coming from an area rather than very small amounts, which would then be difficult to put into sort of projects on the ground. But yeah, the idea is that it's reinvested into habitat straight away, and we're aware that there would otherwise be all sorts of concerns about how this would be tracked and accounted for. So right in the primary legislation in the Environment Act, there's a requirement on the Secretary of State to report annually, I think it is, on the amount of money that's been collected for biodiversity credits and how it's been invested and used. So it will all be used for habitat enhancement and the kind of running of that process. And there should be regular reporting on where it goes as well.
Can I just add something there, Max? Because there's been a few questions about the management and the monitoring and who pays. So I think money coming in, anyone who buys a unit, whether it's a credit or a unit from someone local, that price needs to include the management and monitoring of that site for the 30 years. So obviously, if it's a credit, then the government will be putting that aside. If it's a local habitat banker, a developer, they will need to be putting that money aside. So the money to fund this for that 30-year period is coming from the price of the biodiversity unit or credit.
Thanks, Mel. Okay, great. So I think that's it on that side of things. Just a question for you, Tom, which I know you've answered in the chat, but I think it's worth flagging around the register and how existing biodiversity net gain offset sites will be recorded and included in the register. So I don't know if you just want to quickly explain that process, please.
Sure, thanks, Becky. So game sites have to be registered before a game plan can be approved, and that's out in the Environment Act. So game plan secured as a prerequisite condition as part of the planning permission. Then before the developer can submit the game plan to a local planning authority for approval, they have to make sure that any off-site games are registered and allocated to their development on the National Register. That's kind of the driver behind registering.
Great, thank you. Okay, right, so coming on to sort of the reporting, evaluation and monitoring side of things and enforcement, we've got a few things that are perhaps more points to raise, but also some questions around how that's going to work. So just a point around section 106 being very difficult to enforce. We have developers pleading non-viability and reneging. So how do we enforce the requirement for BNG? So again, I'd encourage, share that example in responding to the consultation. That's really useful to hear. And then more questions. So we've sort of answered the question around the funding of annual monitoring, but just what level of monitoring is proposed to happen? And again, we've answered over how many years, 30 years. And who will be policing the 30 years? And keep if the monitoring's done, who's checking up on that and making sure it happens? So just generally some questions around the enforcement and how that practically is going to happen. And then a specific question around what if a biodiversity net gain unit becomes contaminated, and could the unit end up being taken out of the scheme and reclassed as suitable for development? So that's obviously related to enforcement, but just what happens over that 30-year period if things go wrong. Just on that, I don't know, Max or Tom, do you want to come in first, and then maybe, oh, what have I done? Sorry, I've gone wee with the slides. There we go. Max or Tom, do you want to start on that one, and then others can come in?
Yeah, happy to pick it up, Becky. So in the consultation, we set out a monitoring scheme in time, and we asked a question on whether we think that's suitable. And Natural England are working up a habitat management and monitoring plan template as well, to standardise management and monitoring that happens on site and off site. In terms of enforcement of that, so the monitoring should be secured by the legal agreement, so Section 106 or Conservation Covenant, as well as the management. And then either the local planning authority, if it's a Section 106, or the responsible body, if it's a Conservation Covenant, can then enforce those obligations under that legal agreement. So that in term, last one about contamination.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah, if a site is secured for 30 years, a party, landowner or someone on their behalf is obliged to do certain works on that land and achieve a certain outcome. Now, if there's something happened, it'd be good to hear examples of what we mean by contamination, but if something happened which meant they couldn't achieve that outcome, then they'd be potentially breaching their obligations. You'd risk net gain not being achieved. I think it's not simply a case of it comes out of the agreement and it can be developed on. They perhaps have to look at remediation or what else can be done, or what happens at that point. Because really they need to deliver that outcome. But conservation covenants can be modified by the parties if they're in agreement. So if management wasn't achieving the desired outcome and it needs to be changed to achieve the outcome, then it could be modified. There's provision for that as well.
Brilliant, thanks Max. Does anyone else want to come in on that side of things, sort of around the enforcement and monitoring?
The only thing I was just going to add, just to kind of follow on from what Tom was saying, as well as I think there's still a need for some more clarity around where something has failed despite best endeavours. So at the end of the day, we want to see these outcomes being delivered, but nature doesn't always conveniently sit in the box that you want it to stay in. And so there could be circumstances where you have done everything that was expected of you in terms of management, but things haven't quite turned out as planned. And what's an acceptable level of tolerance of that? But equally, there could be circumstances where it was entirely outside the landowner's control, an act of God type scenario. And so, I think there just is a bit more clarity needed still around what counts as failure, if you like.
Great,
and then when would you go to enforce that?
Thanks, Nick. And I think it would be really great if local authorities can feed back on these points around enforcement. And, I noticed there's a couple of points in the chat around SERDs and how many of those sit unmanaged and not working properly. And we know there's a general issue with, compliance monitoring and enforcement. So it'd be great if that can be fed back and around how that might be made to work, because we at the moment.
Or equally, if there's any good examples of where it is working really well as well, and what was done,
and how that's been done,
that would be really helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And just a couple of questions I've seen actually around the local authority's role and Natural England's role in terms of inspection and enforcement and monitoring. So just to clarify whose role that was be. Do you want to pick that up, Nick, as you're off mute at the moment?
Yeah, Mel may want to add to this as well. But so Natural England is developing a kind of an overarching kind of monitoring and a kind of reporting framework. So we'll be involved at the kind of macro level in terms of advising on how the policy seems to be delivering, looking for perverse outcomes. Is it delivering the kind of aspirations around nature recovery, contribution to ecological networks we're expecting from the policy, but we won't be involved in most instances at the individual project level. That will be down in most cases to either the local planning authority if it's a Section 106, or a responsible body if it's being secured through a conservation covenant to kind of do that sort of enforcement, monitoring, receipt of monitoring reports aspects. Mel, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, yes. So I think where Natural England sees its role is in sort of setting some of the standards, like the biodiversity metric, looking at how the register might work and working with others on that, and thinking about other standards and tools, the habitat management and monitoring plan, for example, and that side of things. So that's where we see our role. And as Nick said, we're not going to be involved in every project everywhere. That will be local authorities. But what we would want to be involved in is the analysis of the information as it comes back in. You know, is when we get information back from projects and back from the 5-year local authority reporting, how does that mean the metric might need to change? Are we targeting this at the right space and the right places to get the biodiversity outcomes that we collectively want, or do we need to do something different? So I think that's where Natural England would see its position in monitoring and feeding back into the system.
Okay, great, thanks guys. Just a couple of other questions sort of around this side of things. I think this is probably around the credit scheme, but perhaps also around just generally off-site delivery. Is there a danger of creating concrete jungles in areas where land is cheap and the benefits going to projects in areas already rich in green spaces? I guess Max or Tom maybe on that one.
So I'll start and Tom do come in. I think that, yeah, there's a risk that anything could happen, right, on a particular site. It'll depend on the particular context and situation. I think there's a couple of things leaning against that happening. Firstly is the fact that the net gain approval comes after the planning application approval. So in order to get to that scenario, you'd have to have a concrete jungle approved, which I would expect to fall foul of various national planning policies and local planning policies on green infrastructure and kind of wider environmental benefits. I'd say also in practice, it doesn't generally work out terribly advantageously for the developer to do it this way. There are benefits to having green space, at least to some extent, in development for the aesthetic of the development, the ability to actually sell them and get them occupied. And also cost in that there's often, I mean, it's rare that the full parcel can be developed, and so there's generally land that can be used for biodiversity net gain or green space within a development. So I think more of the examples I've seen, certainly in practice anyway, actually go the opposite way and have delivered more within the development than was expected, and less has been done off-site than expected. But it's I mean, fundamentally, that risk is why we've created quite a strong presumption in favour of delivering on site rather than locally, rather than always going into the market and long distance solutions for net gain.
Great, thanks, Max.
Becky, can I just
Yeah,
add briefly to that as well? So the experience of COVID has highlighted that many people don't have access. Yeah, it highlighted the importance of green space, but also the fact that there's often inequalities in terms of access to green space. So there's a real opportunity here to kind of link biodiversity net gain to kind of other local policies and aspirations as well. So to use it almost as a kind of financing mechanism, potentially to help provide additional or kind of to fund improvements to existing or provide additional areas of green and blue space, so that you do have opportunities for people to have contact with wildlife locally as well, because we all know we get benefits from that. So also just in terms of thinking about where you want to be creating, going back to habitat banks or kind of some of these strategic opportunities, there's also an opportunity there to address kind of historic inequalities in terms of access to green space and provide for better opportunities for people to have contact and engagement with wildlife, either on site or, you know, like off site, but kind of local to communities as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Nick. I guess we're probably moving on to sort of more general questions now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just click off the screen. Oh, wait a minute, if I can figure out how to do it. There we go. So people can see, we can see people a bit better. So just some more sort of general questions. We've got some around, I guess, the metric and how it all works in terms of calculations of biodiversity net gain, and also the suggestions for biodiversity delivery, which I think, Nick, you answered in the chat, so I don't know if you want to just come in on those, but I think there's quite a useful clarification there around how you calculate biodiversity net gain, and then also how that works in terms of, is that a negotiated issue between the local authority and the developer? And you know, who suggests, sorry, my my words are not coming out properly, how suggestions for biodiversity net gain are arrived at. And I don't know if you just want to quickly cover that. It'd be useful.
Yeah, just so briefly, historically, there's often been kind of grand proposals or schemes that developers have suggested are going to be all singing or dancing fantastic, often kind of little or slightly dubious evidence to support those, and limited opportunity for planning authorities to kind of challenge around it. I think with net gain, it provides a more level playing field in that there's a standardized metric that everybody is using. So yeah, all developers have to use the same type. A developer will be using an ecologist to kind of inform their calculations and their net gain plans. They then have to set out their proposals and provide the full metric calculation to the planning authority to then take a view on that. So it should provide a more transparent, consistent, and hopefully kind of leveler, sorry, bad English, kind of playing field as well, and with less scope for people to try and pull wool over eyes as to what they're proposing.
Okay, great, thanks, Nick. We've had a couple of questions around viability, and there's one here around section 106 can be very difficult to enforce, and we have developers pleading non-viability and reneging. I think we covered that under enforcement, but I think there's also this question around viability. Will there be potential for a viability argument so a developer does not want to meet the BNG requirement? I know that because this is a legal requirement, the viability argument won't be possible in that terms, but obviously it does then impact on other non-statutory measures that then may be there may be questions around whether the developer can provide those alongside these. I don't know if Matt or someone else wants to come in on the viability side of things, just in terms of thoughts on that.
Yeah, so as you say, the BNG requirement is non-negotiable. That's a 10% minimum, which ultimately will, could impact on delivery of certain other measures which come forward. So it's something we're aware of, and as with anything else, if there's particular examples that you're aware of which are good case studies of how net gain could impact considerably on some other things, it would be great for you to provide those in your consultation responses.
Brilliant, thanks, Matt.
And the only bits I'd add to that are firstly that, I mean, our analysis so far and kind of anecdotal evidence is that net gain shouldn't be operating in the same scale really of costs to most of the other contribution drivers, so affordable housing and that sort of thing. So actually I'd have to look very closely at any claims that net gain is precluding full contributions on any of those. But the flip side of that is if you are putting in a requirement for more than 10% locally, it's well worth having a look at the viability of that and making sure that that isn't creating any major viability challenges. So obviously the costs scale up with the percentages as they go up.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, I'm just flipping through because I'm aware of time. So we've had loads of questions, which is great. So I know that we had a question come in before the event around issues with requiring a higher net gain of say 20%, and I know there's been a little bit of chat around that. As Max said, I think the key is going to be just getting evidence for that, and we will. I'm aware that South Cambridgeshire just recently adopted an SPD that it didn't set a requirement for 20%, but it sort of set an aspiration towards that. But we will share, as part of the PAS work, we'll share examples where we know the sort of evidence that's been collated to support those policies, because a few local authorities are looking at going above the 10%. So just to let you know that.
Becky, just to flag it, showing the chat is disabled, and I don't know if that was...
Oh, did I do something? I was having a bit of trouble with the chat, so I may have accidentally... Oh, now my mouse has disappeared again. I think whoever suggested I should have a G&T, I think it's got to that. Oh yeah, I think that was probably me. Apologies, everybody. Do carry on putting your questions. That was not meant to be totally disabled. That was just me. The lack of gin had made me do that. Okay, so just clipping through. I think there was a question earlier on around neighbourhood plans, and I know there's a few questions around local plans as well. and neighbourhood plans and where they fit in terms of biodiversity net gain. I'm just scrolling through to try and find it, and I can't see it.
Yeah,
now.
I think I remember that question, Becky. I think it was asking basically whether net gain is compatible with neighbourhood plans, and I think the answer is simply that it's yes, it's entirely compatible, and in the same way that local plans can sort of put a level of tailoring and finesse on the national net gain requirement, that would also be the case for neighbourhood plans. If there were particular habitats you wanted to see in developments or delivered off-site, that would be a good place to flag them alongside the NRS and local plan.
Brilliant, thanks Max. Yeah, I found it just after you said that, so that's good. Okay, just clipping through. So there is a question about parish councils or having trained ecologists or land managers. I guess that's possibly a question around resourcing. I think that's being dealt with more at the local authority level. I don't know, Max or Kevin, I don't know if you want to come in quickly on that.
Yeah, I think that was in response to somebody else saying that parish councils could do enforcement or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's, yeah, I mean, we're not looking at resourcing at parish council level, we're looking at local authority level. So, I mean, it's certainly noted as a, you know, more local aspect to it. So yeah, noted that comment, and we'll think about that in our deliberations.
And I'm not sure if it's what the question was driving at, but there is a point around kind of transparency and monitoring for protected sites, for parish councils and communities. In that I also saw a couple of comments about SUDs in the chat, and the kind of lack of enforcement and monitoring, and a couple of examples for those. I think we recognise that there are capacity issues with enforcement, which then leads to the two sides of enforcement maybe not happening as much as you'd like. So there's the kind of detection of issues, and then the actual remedy to fix them. I think as much as possible, we want to kind of alleviate the detection burden by making net gain really transparent. So I know from having looked at lots of planning applications in the past few years that it's not always entirely clear what's being proposed, where, how it's meant to be managed, how it's meant to be monitored, which then makes enforcement really difficult later. A sort of big driving factor and priority for net gain is to make all of that really clear, which is why we're at least in some views, overly determined to make it quantitative, because it then does make that enforcement and monitoring later on and reporting a lot easier if anything does go wrong.
Great, thanks, Max. Okay, brilliant. So we've got, I'm aware of time, it's now 10:02, and so I think I just wanted to ask if there are any questions that, key questions I've missed. Obviously, as I said, we're going to capture these. We will, I know we had a question earlier on about sharing the chat and the questions, which we'll definitely do. My cat is just outside the door. He seems to be extremely interested in listening to the end of this biodiversity net gain session and being very annoying. I'm hoping that someone comes and gets him. So if you can hear strange noises in the background, it's not me. Yeah, we will capture those. We'll share the questions and answers that have come through in the chat, so you've got those, and obviously we've got the recording here as well, which we'll share ASAP. Probably be next week that I'll share that, but I'll send that round. Were there any other questions? I'll just check with my colleague Rachel in terms of, are there any key ones you think we should flag now, or shall we?
No, I was, one just came in about the metric, but I can see that Tom has responded by giving a link to the metric that's available online.
Yeah, okay, brilliant.
And just to add to that on metric, there will also be a Secretary of State consultation on it as well, so there will also be a further opportunity if people are interested in and kind of commenting on it.
Okay, great. Nick, while you're off mute, I don't know whether you want to just, there's been a couple of questions around species and ensuring that species come, and then also, you know, exchanging different species for others, around, you know, if you're losing newts, can you put up bat boxes, etc. I don't know if you just want to pick up that in terms of what BNG does around species.
Yeah, so biodiversity net gain is focused on habitat features, and that's what the metric takes into account. So it takes into account things such as, you know, trees, the ponds, the grasslands, the scrub, all things that species obviously depend on. So by kind of valuing all habitats, ensuring, irrespective of whether they're impacted by the development or not, and delivering a gain on those, it should by default be benefiting quite a wide range of species, because it will be providing them with better quality or more kind of habitat. It doesn't, as a policy, directly look for kind of species outcomes, but that's not to say that you can't still do those in combination with net gains. It doesn't change existing species protections, but you could also have local priority species that you're looking to try and achieve outcomes for, and it would just be a case then of saying, and what sort of habitats do those species need? Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
You need a GNT as well, Nick.
Yeah, I think I do. Hang on a second. Sorry, keep talking and I'll come back.
Is that restored you, Nick, or
I'll try. Yeah. So yeah, if you do have local priority species, then again, they will require particular habitat types. It could be scrubby areas of land. It could be flower-rich habitats. So again, if you describe those in your local strategies, then the metric will reward the creation of those habitats as well. So it's indirectly kind of supporting species. But Max, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
No, I think that's the key point, is that it's not, as we said, replacing any existing protections for protected species, where you should have equivalent compensation, so no black boxes for newt impacts and that sort of thing. And that, yeah, the reason Net Gain takes a broad habitat-based approach is so that it does help address the impacts for every group of species and reflects the full taxonomic diversity of the local ecosystems. And I'd say just on, I think the species abundance point in the chat's an interesting one. I think species abundance and richness can work really well at a national or local level for targets. I don't think it's an appropriate target for a development site, because if you think about it, development could do some really awful habitat creation. Let's use the newt example given in the chat. Really awful, horrible pond. Stick it next to an existing pond. The horrible pond will still get a few newts in. I can guarantee it. They're not that fussy, and it would be considered good in terms of habitat. It's not good at a site level for detecting environmental quality, because it's very influenced by what's around it. So I think there's a bit of nuance in there, but I take the point. Generally, at the local and national level, we are obviously looking at species abundance and other measures of biodiversity beyond habitats.
Great, thanks.
Could I just add something in? So I think we've mentioned local nature recovery strategies a few times, and I think sort of, what it floats to the consultation is the best way to know where to put things, whether it's for species or habitats, is to articulate that in your local nature recovery strategy and make sure your local plan is talking to that, and then it becomes clear where nature will benefit most, whether it's the newt example or the trees example, or flood risk management. All of those things could be catered for in that plan, and biodiversity net gain can be driven into that in your local area.
Great, thanks, Mel. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. Just run through a last couple of bits. So we are just going to do a quick poll on how you thought today was. It'd be great if you could answer that. We will also be sending round a questionnaire afterwards by email. So if you can answer that, it's just really useful for us to understand how to sort of do these events in the future. What you might need more support on, but also to feedback, obviously, to Defra. As I mentioned already, we've got frequently asked questions on our website already. We'll be adding questions that have come out of this event to them, but we will also specifically share the chat and the answers that have come through in the chat on this one as well. We've got ongoing support through our project, and I'm just going to run through quickly what we're covering there, and we will be putting the recording of this on our website very soon. I think I'll do that next week, but I'll let you know when it goes up. And don't forget to respond to the consultation. That's what this is all about. Remind us of your website. Could someone else, one of the other PAS folk, just bung the link to the website in the
I'll do that, Becky.
Lovely, thanks, Rach. Okay, cool. Right, okay, so just a bit of what we're doing. We ran some events in the summer, which were more, we had a bit of an overview of biodiversity net gain, and we also had some workshop sessions. We had a specific session for councillors where we had some great presentations from councillors in Maidstone and also Salford. The slides for that are available on our website, so do have a look at those. We also have a biodiversity metric workshop for planners, which is on our website if you're interested in knowing more about the workshop. That's a recording. We've got these events which will be recorded, and we're also running those deep dives for officers on specific topics, so please engage with your officers around those. We've got a discussion forum, we've got an advisory group. We're looking to set up a councillor advisory group. We've got some volunteers from our sessions in the summer, but if you're interested, please do get in touch with me if you're interested in being on that group, because we're going to be developing more sort of focused resources specifically for the councillors, so we really want to get your input into what we need to do for those. We're going to we've already got the frequently asked questions on our website, but we're developing that as part of a wider resource centre on biodiversity net gain. We've got some overarching intro stuff, some stuff around our events and what those fed back, but we're going to be looking really around the journey to biodiversity net gain. You know, what can you start doing now? What can you start in terms of preparing for 2023, sharing some examples, some case studies. So if you've got good examples, please do pass them on. But yeah, just keep an eye out for those, and we'll be, if you're not already, please do sign up for Paz's bulletin, our newsletter. You can sign up for that through the website, because that's where we publicise these things. But thank you very much for your time. Thanks for all your comments, and thanks for staying so late as well. Yeah, I'll let you all go off and get your whatever your preferred beverage is, whether that's a G&T or maybe just a nice cup of tea. Yes, thank you again, and we will yeah, hopefully see you at future workshops in the future. So thank you, everybody.